They didn't hate you, not truly. What they hated was what you revealed. Your presence, your silence, your refusal to play by their script. It unsettled them, not because you were wrong, but because you were right in ways they couldn't admit. So they twisted the story. They made you the problem, the villain, the cause of chaos. Because facing their own reflection was too unbearable. You became the scapegoat for wounds they never wanted to heal, the target for guilt they refused to carry. But deep down they knew, they always knew, you weren't the storm, you were the one who survived it, and that truth frightened them more than any lie they ever told. You reflected what they couldn't face in themselves. They say the truth sets you free, but not everyone wants freedom. Some want comfort, even if it's wrapped in delusion. You didn't walk into their lives to expose them, but your presence alone began to do just that. You were a mirror, a silent, still mirror. And while you were only trying to be yourself, they saw too much in you, too much of what they were running from. Your honesty highlighted their manipulation. Your calm revealed their chaos. Your loyalty made their selfishness unbearable. And your boundaries. Oh, your boundaries made them feel small. You didn't raise your voice, but your values spoke louder than any accusation. You didn't point fingers, yet your consistency felt like a spotlight on their inconsistencies. You didn't have to call them out. You simply had to exist. That was enough. Enough to awaken what they spent years burying. So they did what many do when faced with their own discomfort. They turned on the mirror. They broke it, blamed it, labeled it the problem, not because it was cracked, but because it was clear. You were clarity in a world that thrived on confusion. You were authenticity in rooms that celebrated masks. And you were presence in places where absence had always been safer. That's why they needed to turn the narrative against you. Because if you were right, then their whole story, built on denial and self-preservation, would collapse. So they painted you as arrogant, difficult, ungrateful, when all you ever did was hold the line of truth, not aggressively, not vengefully, but simply, silently, with unwavering strength. They couldn't handle that. Not because you were harmful, but because you weren't hurting like they expected you to. They wanted you to break. They wanted you to explode, to lash out, to prove their assumptions right. But you didn't. You chose stillness, you chose dignity, and in doing so, you held up a mirror they could no longer avoid. Every lie they told themselves began to tremble in your presence. Every fake smile, every hollow excuse, every manipulation. They all looked different when reflected in someone who no longer needed to play along. So they rewrote the script. You've changed, they said. You're acting different. No, you weren't. You were just no longer hiding. You weren't pretending anymore, and that made them uncomfortable, because you were never the problem. You were just the first to stop pretending. And when someone stops pretending, the whole illusion starts to fall apart. That's what terrified them, not you, but the truth that came with you, the truth they weren't ready to face. So they did the only thing their fragile egos could handle. They made you the villain in their story. But in the quiet of their own minds, in the silence between their words, there is a discomfort they cannot shake. Because deep down, a part of them knows you weren't reflecting darkness into their lives. You were simply showing them the darkness that was already there. Blame is a refuge for the insecure blame. It's the easiest shelter for those who cannot stand in the storm of their own accountability. And so they ran to it. They wrapped it around themselves like a shield, like a story that sounded better than the truth. Because to admit fault, to say, maybe I was wrong, takes a strength many don't have. And you became the perfect escape route, the perfect excuse. You were easy to blame, not because you deserved it, but because you were available, present, strong, silent. You didn't fight back the way they expected. You didn't beg for acceptance or argue for your innocence. That made you even more dangerous. Your silence made their guilt louder, so they had to distort it. They had to make it look like you were the one causing damage, like you were the unstable one, the unreasonable one, the one with the problem. Because if they painted you as the issue, they wouldn't have to look in the mirror. And for someone deeply insecure, that mirror is terrifying. You see, it was never about truth. It was always about control, and control is best maintained through a clear villain. That's why they chose you. You didn't lose your temper. You didn't betray them. You didn't seek revenge. What you did was worse in their eyes. You maintained self-respect. You walked away. You distanced yourself. You didn't explain your every breath or beg for understanding. That, to them, was unforgivable because it made them feel unimportant. It made them feel powerless, and nothing stirs insecurity more than watching someone you tried to tear down rise silently above it. That's when the blame begins, carefully placed, soft at first. You're too sensitive. You overreacted. Then more severe, you're the toxic one. You ruined everything, but you knew the truth even if no one else did. You carried it like a quiet fire. You didn't need to shout it. You just lived it. And that again made them uneasy, because when someone knows who they are, blame no longer sticks to them. It slides off. And that kind of inner stability exposes those who have built their identity on shifting sand. Insecurity cannot coexist with authenticity. So when you walked in with truth, with consistency, with calm, their insecurities had nowhere to hide. That's why they attacked. That's why they lied. Because it was easier to destroy your name than to deal with the weight of their own actions. Blame became their comfort, their language, their story. And they told it well, so well that even others began to believe it. But you stayed quiet, not because you were weak, but because you understood something they didn't. The truth doesn't need constant defense. It stands, it lasts, it waits, and eventually the blame they threw like daggers will fall at their own feet. Because the insecure can only hide behind blame for so long. Sooner or later, the mask slips. The story falls apart, and when that day comes, you won't need revenge. You won't need to shout, "I told you so." Because by then, your peace will be louder than their noise. Your growth will speak for itself. And they'll be left standing in the ruins of their own blame, wondering why the person they tried to break never looked back. You were never the problem. You were just the truth they couldn't bear to face. You disrupted the power imbalance. They never wanted peace. They wanted control. And as long as you stayed small, compliant, and accommodating, they were comfortable. As long as you apologized first, second, guessed yourself, explained your emotions in circles, and bent to their moods, everything remained in their favor. That wasn't harmony. It was dominance disguised as relationship. They thrived in the imbalance where your silence fed their pride and your empathy covered their insecurity. But one day, something shifted. Maybe you didn't even notice it at first. A subtle change. You paused before replying. You questioned what once felt unquestionable. You stopped absorbing every blame thrown your way, and that small defiance, your refusal to keep shrinking, rattled them. Because when someone builds their identity on being superior, they need you to stay inferior. Your strength wasn't just inconvenient, it was threatening. It disturbed the entire dynamic they had quietly enforced. The moment you stood up for yourself, not with rage, not with rebellion, but with quiet certainty, the scales tipped. You weren't playing the same role anymore. You started asking questions they didn't want to answer. You started making choices without their approval. You began acting like your voice mattered, because it did. And suddenly they didn't feel as powerful anymore. That's when the accusations came. You've become cold. You're acting selfish. But what they really meant was, you're no longer under my control. You see, control doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it's hidden in guilt, trips in passive aggression, in unspoken expectations. And you, who used to feel guilt for having needs, no longer bowed to that script. You no longer tried to please those who only loved you when you were easy to manipulate. And that terrified them. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you finally did something right. You protected your energy. You said no without explaining. You enforced boundaries without permission, and the moment you did that, the illusion shattered. They could no longer depend on your silence to make themselves feel righteous. So they needed to rewrite the story again. They needed to make you look like the unreasonable one. Why? Because if the world saw the truth, that you had been keeping the peace while they kept the power, their false image would collapse. You see, people who crave control don't want equal relationships. They want leverage, and when you took that leverage away, they panicked. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't destroy anything. You simply rebalanced the scale. And it exposed how heavily they had been leaning on your compliance. So they called it betrayal, but it wasn't betrayal. It was liberation. It wasn't rebellion. It was recovery. You weren't the one disrupting the relationship. You were just removing the false weight they placed on your shoulders. And that kind of shift is something many cannot tolerate. Because once you stop playing your old role, they're forced to confront their own. And that's something control-driven people never want to do. So they retreat. They lash out. They victimize themselves. Anything to avoid the truth that you didn't become the problem. You just stopped being the solution to a dynamic that was never healthy. And in doing so, you reclaimed something priceless. Your voice, your worth, your center, and once reclaimed, you never need to give it away again. The power imbalance wasn't disrupted by force. It was undone by presence. And now, they have no idea what to do with someone they can no longer control. Your peace exposed their chaos. Some people don't know who they are without conflict. They need it, like oxygen, not because they enjoy pain, but because chaos distracts them from their own emptiness. So when you entered the room carrying peace, calm, and clarity, you didn't soothe them. You unsettled them. You became a mirror they never asked for. Your steady presence made their noise more obvious. Your patience made their outbursts look reckless. Your silence made their games echo louder than they ever expected. And that terrified them, because the moment someone doesn't react, the manipulator loses control. They throw the bait and you don't bite. They push the buttons and nothing happens. They wait for your rage, your breakdown, your apology, and it never comes. Instead, they're met with something they've never had to face before: stillness. And that stillness is not weakness. It is power, the kind of power that can't be bought, borrowed, or faked. You didn't come to win an argument. You didn't come to prove them wrong. You simply stopped letting their chaos decide who you are. That decision alone shook everything, because they were never prepared to deal with someone who didn't need validation from their approval or guilt from their disappointment. They were never ready to face someone who doesn't get pulled into emotional hurricanes. They were used to people reacting, crying, shouting, chasing, explaining. But you stepped back. You stayed calm. You chose dignity over drama, and they couldn't understand it. So they called you cold. They said you were heartless, detached, emotionless. But the truth is, they weren't describing you. They were describing how powerless they felt when their chaos no longer worked. Because peace, real peace, has a strange way of drawing out every mask in the room. It doesn't confront with violence. It exposes with silence. And when you didn't participate in the tension they tried to create, their whole illusion started falling apart. That's when they decided, you must be the problem. Because how could you be so calm unless you were guilty? How could you walk away so silently unless you were heartless? They needed a reason for your peace, and since they didn't understand it, they turned it into a weapon against you. But they didn't realize your peace was hard-earned. It came from walking through fire without burning, from breaking cycles without shouting, from healing wounds without making noise about them. They didn't see the storms you already survived, the wars you chose not to fight, the weight you refused to carry anymore. That peace didn't come cheap. It came from learning to breathe without chaos. And you weren't going to give that up, not for anyone, especially not for those who only felt powerful when you were disturbed. So let them say what they will. Let them spin their stories. You don't need to defend your calm to those who thrive on confusion. You don't need to prove your peace is real to those who can't sit in silence with their own mind. You didn't come to play their game. You outgrew it. You didn't show up to fix them. You chose to free yourself. And in that freedom, in that quiet, in that grounded refusal to react, you became untouchable, because nothing scares a chaotic soul more than someone who has mastered their own. You weren't the cause of the conflict. You were just the end of it. They feared who you might become without them. There's something unsettling to small minds about someone who begins to realize their own worth. The moment you started to grow beyond the limits they placed on you, they felt it, not just as distance, but as a threat. You weren't angry, you weren't vengeful, you were just evolving, and that frightened them more than any argument ever could, because deep down, they had always counted on your dependency. They built their sense of power on your need for approval, your constant explaining, your desire to belong. But then, something changed. You stopped needing their validation to breathe. You stopped shrinking just to keep the peace. You stopped asking, "Am I too much?" and started asking, "Why was I ever trying to be less?" That shift, it was everything. It made them realize that without their permission, you were stepping into a version of yourself they couldn't control. A version of you that no longer fit the narrative where they were the strong one, the wise one, the one who helped you. And so they panicked, not because you hurt them, but because you didn't need them anymore. And for people who feed off control, off being the center of your emotional gravity, your independence is their worst nightmare. They feared your strength, your confidence, your clarity, not because it harmed them, but because it exposed how little they had to do with your survival. You see, when someone is secretly invested in your stagnation, your healing feels like betrayal. When they've cast themselves as your savior, your freedom makes their role obsolete. And when they've convinced others that you're unstable, broken, or weak, your rise is an undeniable contradiction to the script they worked so hard to sell. That's why they rushed to destroy your image before you could grow into it. They whispered, they blamed, they twisted the past, not because you were a danger, but because your potential was, because your light might show others that the version of you they described was never real. And that is something the insecure cannot survive. So they planted doubt in places you once trusted. They tried to convince you that growth was selfish, that distance was cruelty, that choosing yourself was abandonment. But none of it was true. What they really feared was irrelevance. They feared a day when their opinion no longer shaped your decisions, when their silence no longer punished you, when their approval no longer defined you. And that day came quietly, powerfully. It arrived the moment you chose peace over chaos, truth over comfort, and growth over guilt. You didn't become better than them. You just became better for yourself. And in doing so, you became unreachable to the person they wanted you to stay. They may still talk. They may still twist the story. But inside, they know. They know you didn't leave to hurt them. You left to find you. And what you found is someone who doesn't need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. Someone who doesn't chase what's already running. Someone who doesn't shrink just to be accepted. They feared who you might become without them, and now they're watching it unfold. You're not angry, you're not bitter, you're just gone, evolved, detached, focused, and there's no version of their story that can stop what's coming next. The rise of the person they tried so hard to hold back.